Lakeland Public Television and area news partners are proud to present Debate Night 2012, a look at our area legislative candidates. And now, the Senate District 9 debate. Your moderator tonight is Ray Gildow.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Ray Gildow. Welcome to Debate 2012, 11 debates over 4 nights here on Lakeland Public Television. This is our third evening of the debates. We'll have 2 this evening, one from 7 till 8, another one this evening from 9 till 10, and then the last 3 will be tomorrow night, starting at 7 o'clock. Tonight we have Senate District 9, and we have our 2 candidates for the Senate District race. I'd like to introduce to my left, who is running for the district from the Democratic side, Doty. And to his left is Paul Gazelka, who is running as a Republican. I'd like to also identify our panel, our very distinguished panel this evening, who are going to be asking questions. Some of the questions are coming from them, and some will be coming from the general public. To my right is Dennis Wyman, who is the Lakeland Public Television News Director. And to his right is Scott Hall, who is, I'm sorry, Scott's down in the end, so we'll skip down to the end. Scott Hall is a news director for KAXE Radio out of Grand Rapids. And then Tom West is located in the middle. Tom West is the Morrison County Record Editor and General Manager in Little Falls. I'd like to just briefly give you an idea how the rules will operate this evening so everybody understands sort of how we're going to do this. We'll try to keep it more organized than the presidential debates were last night. That was a little bit crazy at times. There will be 3 minutes. The panel will be asked questions. The panel will ask questions after opening comments. And the opening comments, each candidate will have 3 minutes. And then some will be their own questions, as I said, coming from the panel here. The candidates will rotate the order they speak, beginning with opening comments and finishing with closing comments. Each candidate gets 2 minutes to answer the questions. Each candidate will have a 1-minute rebuttal opportunity, and questions will continue until we are about 50 minutes into the debate. And then we will come to the closing comments, and we'll sort of have a reverse order from how we started for those. The closing comments will be 2 minutes each. Just a quick note here that we'll try to keep these as close as we can as the 2 minutes. We do have a timer sitting off camera, so we'll try to keep everybody on track and follow these 2 minutes as close as we possibly can. So we'll start the debate with Dennis Wyman, starting with the first question. What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. First, we need our opening comments. And I think we're going to start with Mr. Gazelka. We'll be doing the opening comment section.
Well, hi, I'm State Senator Paul Gazelka, and as we start, I first want to say hi, Marilee, and Lydia, I know you're watching. Marilee and I have been married 30 years, and we have 5 children, Lydia being the youngest, and then 4 older ones, and so life's been a blast, and thanks for the ride. I'm the state senator right now in Morrison County in the bottom half of Crow Wing. That's changing, and I think we'll talk about that. But I think the biggest thing I can talk about when we start out is, did I do what I said I was going to do 2 years ago? I think that's important for you to know. Did I do what I said I was going to do? The very first thing I said I would do is my first bill would be to author legislation for term limits. I absolutely did that. That was Senate File 12. In the end, I couldn't get enough legislators to agree with me that we should limit our time there. But the other things I talked about was the need to rein in runaway government spending, and did I do that? And well, when we first went down there, for Republicans for the first time in 38 years took the House and Senate. We had the majority of the House and Senate for the first time in 38 years, and the first thing we encountered was that we were $6 billion short. Prior legislative bodies left us $6 billion short. And it wasn't that we didn't have more money, it was that the automatic spending increases were more than we had. And so we reined that in. We promised to do it, we did that, we reduced the spending curve, and in the end, a year later, February of this year, we have a $1.2 billion surplus. So that was very, very important for the economic security of our families in our region. The next thing I talked about was focusing on becoming a business-friendly state, focusing on how do we help the private sector grow jobs, because in the end, if they succeed, we all win. And so we looked at a variety of issues. I'm sure we'll be talking about them more, but regulatory reform, business property taxes, we tried to change that. tort or liability reform, just a number of areas we looked at and said, how do we do this better? And we need to. I'll probably mention this again, but we rank number 45 out of 50 as far as business-friendly states, and we've got to do better on that. And finally, I said I would stand for Minnesota values, what I call Central Minnesota values. I stand for pro-life, and I'm endorsed by MCCL. I can tell you that I was very active in the marriage amendment, Second Amendment rights, photo ID, some of those basic issues that I think are important to all of us. So pay attention. It should be a good night.
Thank you. Mr. Doty.
Well, first of all, thank you to the panel, thank you to the crew, and most of all, thank you to everybody that's watching and listening out there. I appreciate that when people take their time. I have lived over 40 years in this district. My wife Donna and I live in Royalton. Hi, hon. Grew up on a farm in western Minnesota, graduated from the University of Minnesota at Morris. I taught and coached wrestling at Pierce High School for a long time. I was hired as senior advocate to fill the needs of senior citizens in Morrison, Crow Wing, parts of Todd County. So this new district is pretty familiar to me from past jobs. I am currently on the City Council in Royalton. I am on the Board of Directors for Pine Grove Zoo in Little Falls, and I'm on the Camp Ripley Citizens Advisory Council. I have been involved in many local organizations. I have a list of about 20 endorsements. If that sort of thing interests you, I hope you'll take the time to check out my website, which is aldoty.com, and take a look at those. As I said, I did 2 terms in the Minnesota legislature after I did my senior advocate career. And I was defeated last time by a whole bunch of outside big money. And I decided to run again. I decided to run again because I watched the last legislature lead us into a shutdown rather than compromise. I watched them increase the property tax burden on rural Minnesota, landowners, homeowners, small business, and borrow their way to what they're calling a balanced budget. I watched them vote to make sure the giant corporations kept their profits without worrying particularly about the middle class. This is not rural values, and this is a rural district. And I think those aren't my values. My values would go the other direction. So, as my opponent said, I think this will be a good debate tonight. I think we deserve better. I think the middle class has been forgotten for these last couple of years, and I would certainly change that. My personal background is well suited to this district. I have been in farming. I have lived on a lake. I have lived in small towns. I have prepared young people for their futures, and I have helped senior citizens cope with the problems of aging. That's pretty much the people of this district. I have a political science degree. I have 2 terms of legislative experience. I think that's a good fit for the area. And I hope you'll put me back to work to serve you as your next state senator. Thanks, and looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Doty. Just to review again now, we will start with a question from the panel. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to react to that question, and then each candidate will have a 1-minute rebuttal to rebut whatever has been said back and forth between them. So we'll start with Mr. Wyman.
Okay, thanks, Ray, and thank both of you for being here tonight. Of course, you're both former debate participants here on Lakeland Public Television. It's good to see you again. But times are changing. Your district redistricting happened this year, and District 9 now includes farmers in the southern portion, Lakes Country in the northern half, really a unique situation. What challenges does this present as a legislator in this district, and why should voters from both parts of the district vote for you?
And we'll start with Mr. Doty.
Well, one of the reasons that I chose to run for Senate this time instead of House was the fact that this district is really just a bigger version of what we had before. The old House district that I represented was farms in the south, lakes in the north. We had pockets of pretty big wealthy areas around Bay Lake. Now we have kind of the same situation. We have a lot of farming country in the south and in the west. We have a lot of lake country. We have some pockets of great wealth around Gull Lake area. And then we have some pockets of very poor people. So it's an extremely diverse district. And when you mentioned what are the challenges, I think probably the biggest challenges that I noticed when I was in the legislature would be environmental votes. let's take a feedlot issue, for example. Hey, the southern half of my district, oh yeah, let's build those feedlots. Northern half, hey, those are our lakes, and if that's going to run off in there, so you're going to have a lot of trouble figuring out the balance to do what's necessary for the ag areas to make their living, because they're a huge important part of the economic system here. Of course, you have to have farming be able to work. But we also realize that nobody makes money in the long run. The farmers want to take care of the environment. They're not the enemies of the environment by any means. They either want to pass that farm down to their kids, or they want to sell it for a profit when they're done. So we have to take care of the environment, and it's a narrow, tight line that you have to walk to do both of those, and it's going to be the same exact challenge in this district.
Thank you. Mr. Gazelka.
It is unique in that when my district was cut in half, I had to make a choice between either serving Morrison County or Crow Wing, and I chose to serve Morrison County, which means we picked up Todd, Wadena, and Southwest Cass. And so my wife and I now live in Southwest Cass, north of Pillager and Fairview Township. But there are basic areas. Agriculture is one of the areas, and I can tell you that I serve on the Environment Committee, which deals with all the permitting related to agriculture. It also deals with all the lakes areas related to, for example, aquatic invasive species. All of those things are wrapped up into there. And then the other area that is very, very important to this area is Camp Ripley and the veterans, and I can tell you that I also serve on the Veterans Committee. In fact, I helped pass some key legislation for veterans coming back. We give them preferential hiring treatment, both from government employers and also private sector employers, because we want to take care of our veterans coming back. So there's those many reasons, but it all still comes back down to jobs. It doesn't matter, frankly, whether you're here, whether you're farther north of here, whether you're in the Twin Cities. We have to figure out how to grow private sector jobs. And my background, I'm a business owner. I've been in a business owner for decades. I've had 3 to 7 employees all the way through that time. And I know that if we don't figure out how to help our private sector grow jobs, everything else suffers. And so that'll be my focus for our area.
Any rebuttal, Mr. Doty, of any kind?
No.
Hearing none? Okay, we'll go to question number 2, and we'll go to Mr. West.
Thanks, Ray. When the legislature and Governor Dayton finally reached agreement on a budget last year, they came in and they decided that the state was going to spend about a little bit more than $34 billion over the next 2 years on all of the activities that it's involved in. And since then, of course, we've had some inflation, and there are some commitments that the state has made, perhaps with employee contracts or so forth. But I'm wondering, where do you sit as far as how much should the state be spending? How much, if we're at $34 billion today, in the next 2 years, how much do you expect that the state ought to come in at spending?
We'll start that question with Mr. Gazelka.
Well, that's fairly complicated. I can tell you in 1971, our annual budget was $1 billion, and now we're spending about $17 billion. And with inflation, that shouldn't have doubled more than a couple times, so roughly $4 billion, somewhere in there. The shutdown was, we should at least talk about that briefly. When we took over, the prior 2-year budget was $30 billion. With the automatic spending increases, they wanted to spend $39 billion, and we had $34 billion in the checkbook. So we actually were willing to spend more because we had more money in the checkbook, but the governor and the Democratic side wanted to spend higher than that. They wanted to raise taxes for that. So it was really a struggle over should we spend more or tax more, or should we reduce spending? And we knew that if we focused on reducing spending, we could get within those numbers, and so we did. And so the first thing I look at is how much money is coming into the checkbook. And then secondly, we have to look at our willingness to reform government. And that's one of the things we did this year is why we have a budget surplus now, is we looked at all the areas we could reform. For just 2 examples, in state government, we said, why don't we have companies like IBM come into Minnesota, it's a Minnesota company, look at our state government and see if they could save us money. And in other states, they've saved states as much as $400 million. And so we wanted them to come here, look at our fleet management, look at our utilities, looking at our tax analytics, and save money for the state. And then one other area that we worked on was every agency in Minnesota had IT departments. So that means that everyone had to reinvent technology every time. And so instead we consolidated those all into one to save money. So we're looking at all the areas we can save money, and in the end, some of that will determine how much we should be spending.
Mr. Doty.
Well, I think the proper answer to how much should we spend would depend on you tell me what the economy is going to be like in 2 years, and I'll happily tell you how much of that we should spend. The point being that we have very different needs depending on what the economy is like. It's kind of a reverse situation for government. When times are tough, more government services are needed. And so it's easy to go out there at campaign time and say, times are tough for you, so we're going to cut back, we're going to cut. And yet that's the very time when more and more government services are needed to help people. We have unemployment, we have all the problems, people lose their job, then they're losing their health care, they're doing all these things. And so we either throw these people under the bus, off the side of the road, or whatever words you want to use, or we take care of them. And it's my personal choice to take care of them as best we can. You obviously can't spend money you don't have. That's always the difficult choice. I think there were mistakes made this past time. I think it was a wrong decision to extend property taxes the way they were. I think they went the wrong place. The property tax increases this past time fall 64% on rural Minnesota. We don't have 64% of the people. We don't have 64% of the wealth. But we got 64% of that property tax increase. And when you walk the streets here and see boarded up businesses in our small towns, you know that that's the wrong direction to go. So the exact right amount to spend is going to depend. Things are picking up now. The surplus that he talks about, sales tax is picking up a little because people are buying. Income tax is going to pick up later because a few more people are working. So it's going to be tough to keep this slow recovery going up instead of collapsing on itself. So I wish I could give you an exact number. Again, you give me an exact condition for what the economy was like, and I think we can work towards that exact number.
Mr. Gazelka, do you have any rebuttal there?
Property taxes, we do need to reform and improve, but I've got to tell you that the average this year went up 2.3%, and next year it's supposed to actually be negative across the state, versus the 10-year average was 6.9%. So, and I give credit to, frankly, our local governments for working on reining in the expenses that they had. But as far as, I hope we get to this later too, but there's a conversation about we changed from a market homestead credit to a market exclusion, and that was the same piece of legislation that I voted for this year. Al Doty voted for in 2007, and it was given to us by the League of Cities, League of Counties. They said this would be a good way to provide more transparency for the situation, how we do property taxes. So it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't anything different between me and my opponent on that one.
Mr. Doty, do you have any?
Well, I think if you go back and look at both of those bills, you'll see that there certainly were some differences, and of course economic conditions were different as well. The thing that's troubling about this particular property tax increase is where it falls. There are many, many farmers who have talked to me, brought their property tax statements to me, and said, look at this. 20%, 30%, 200 and some percent in a couple of cases, fantastic increases that family farmers simply can't afford, can't absorb. And so between those and the people trying to, not the super nice places on the big lakes, but the family cabins on lakes that have been in the family for a couple generations, those are the people that are getting hurt by this because the burden is out here. And I think we need to redistribute that. We need to take another look at that. Personally, I want to see that homestead credit come back. The damage that was done by taking it away, far too great on a rural district like this.
Thank you. Question number 3 comes from Mr. Hall.
Hi, thanks. The Brainerd Lakes area has been kind of on the front lines for many years now, of the intensive development of our shorelines, people moving on. And the challenge there is to, of course, preserve the character and environmental quality of our water system, our lakes and streams. And I just wonder how you evaluate where we are now in managing the quality of our water, the habitat for the wildlife, as well as you might, if you have time, talk about the invasive species concerns and how they can harm our lakes and streams.
Mr. Doty.
Another complicated question, but a very good question, especially for this district. Last night I was one of the legislative candidates that appeared at the Rice Area Sportsman's Club. They invited everybody from the area that's running for anything practically, and this was topics of questions from the audience. And they're concerned about two things with the water quality, runoff and invasives. Some areas, especially southwestern Minnesota, runoff is a bigger concern than invasives right now, and we've made good progress on that. I think all of the farm organizations are behind the TMDL studies and things that are going to hopefully bring us down to a manageable level, get us back to water that actually has capability of keeping fish and not just algae. Invasive species aren't just plants. I said earlier I live in Royalton and I do some fishing below Blanchard Dam. It's a great spot to catch fish sometimes. Oops, shouldn't be telling no secrets, but it's full of zebra mussels. And we had a big controversy last night at that sportsman's meeting I was talking about with how on earth can you possibly check everything inside of your motor when you're leaving a lake to see if there's because these zebra mussels are, without a microscope, you can't find them when they're in the first stages of their life. How are we ever going to stop these? And the bills that were introduced last time required, the DNR claims that they're going to require a lot more people to do checking. We put that burden on them. And people don't quite understand sometimes. They think they're going to put more people out here to fine people. Well, I hope that we're moving in the direction of education rather first instead of fining later. We can slow these things down. Some of them we can't stop, but we need to slow it down. We need to educate people to do the best we can because that's an important economic driver in this area.
Thank you. Mr. Gazelka.
Well, taking care of the environment, whether it's our lakes or our forests or ag land, it all fits together. It's one of the reasons I like to serve on the Environment Committee. In particular, the AIS issue is something that we worked heavily on at the Capitol that I was involved with. Zebra mussels in particular, roughly 10% of our lakes and streams have aquatic invasive species, and so we said, how do we slow this down? Because frankly, right now there is no silver bullet to wipe them out. And so we provided some resources to the University of Minnesota to begin research. We're hoping that we do find an answer. For example, like the lamprey eel that came up through the Great Lakes, they found a way to minimize them and to not eradicate them, but to take care of that problem. But then we also have some money for education. We want people to know what they're doing when they take a boat out of the water, and if they leave weeds on there. If they have a wakeboard boat and they leave water in that bow and then empty it out, it could create problems. And so there's no silver bullet yet, but we're working on it. But with the rest of my time, I want to come back to the ag land because sometimes we have issues that we can't really address because we're moving forward in the forum. But I'm very concerned about the rise in prices of taxes of ag land. The state average for ag land was up 10.8%, so everybody got impacted there. One of the biggest reasons, though, has nothing to do with the changes we made. It has to do with the values of ag land going up, on average over 5%, and then the values of residential property and businesses values going down. The pie is the same, but if one goes up and the other two go down, that area is paying more. And so I'm all ears. I want to find ways to correct that. We got to help the farmers, and that's one thing we should work on.
Any rebuttal of any kind, Mr. Doty?
Yes. I'm carry this with me because a lot of people don't understand the changes from moving from homestead credit to homestead exclusion. This is from the Department of Revenue's website. And it talks about those tax increases, and it talks about the fact that they fall on rural Minnesota. And they talk about the fact that the property taxes are indeed due to changing from credit to exclusion. So to claim that your farm tax increases are simply due to the increased value of farmland, and I hope we're not headed to another 1980s scenario there, but it's another matter that maybe we'll have a question on. But I urge people to check out the Department of Revenue's explanation for this. It's better than politicians arguing their side of the story.
Mr. Gazelka?
Yeah, I want to comment. I don't deny that it's not. It wasn't exactly what we want. We could have something better. I want to remind you that my opponent also voted for the proposal, or very similar to what we have. But the other thing that we added to that that we need to talk about is we increased the property tax refund program, where a homeowner, if their increase was 12% and $100 or more, would get up to 90% of that increase back. Because we recognized that people were hurting and we wanted to find a way to help them, and this was one way that we could do it. Initially the governor vetoed it, but eventually we got that through, and that's one way that we can work on this. And so I thought you should at least be aware of that part of it. Property taxes are complicated. You need to be aware that it's not just the state government. You've got your local school levies, your cities, all the different groups involved in there, and it's interesting that it often gets blamed on the state government, kind of like the state government blames the federal, but we're all in this together, and certainly I want to work with the local governments to help them out.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Mr. Wyman and will be directed first to Mr. Gazelka.
Both of you say you're pro-life. Mr. Gazelka has authored pro-life legislation while in St. Paul, and Mr. Doty, on your website, you report you've received a 100% rating from MCCL every year in office. Are you two completely on the same page here, or are there some differences?
I guess that was for me.
Yes.
Well, I'm unashamedly and passionately pro-life. I'm a champion of pro-life. I think it's important that we take a stand for that. Some of the key differences would be the Republican Party is pro-life. And so anytime we have the majority, we actually try to pass pro-life legislation. I was the chief author of MCCL's bill this year, basically banning webcam abortions, where you could do a video camera and a city a long ways away, a doctor could prescribe RU-486 and destroy that child in the womb. But that's a fundamental difference between the two of us. Another major area that we are different is I would never vote for a leader that is pro-abortion. And my opponent has always voted for the Speaker of the House that is pro-abortion. So there's a big, big difference there. Plus, I carry the legislation. I'm not afraid to say that it's important, and I will stand for life. And last thing I'll say, too, I probably mentioned, I'll mention again, that I'm the MCCL endorsed candidate. They're the ones that look at the records and look at how we stand and what we do and make their decisions accordingly.
Mr. Doty.
Well, I need to certainly react to several of those statements. I think, Paul, you nailed it here when you talked about Republicans claiming at least to be the pro-life party. The nice thing about being a Democrat is you can be either one, which is one of the reasons that I am a Democrat, and one of the reasons that I think people are learning to appreciate. We don't have to all be the same. One of the first things, within the first couple of weeks of my first term in caucus, this pro-life, or I'm not quite sure what you called, Margaret, there, pro-abortion or what terms you use, because I've heard her called a lot of things. One of the very first things that Speaker Kelleher told us, our caucus does not take a position on pro-life. You are free to vote your district, you are free to vote your conscience. And there are several of us pro-life Democrats, and we certainly take that to heart. And I think what it looks like to me, the biggest difference in our pro-life issues, because whether you got 93% in 2011 instead of 100, by the time you figure these percentage differences, maybe not so much. But it does trouble me when people say that they're 100% pro-life and then are trying to equate that somehow with a party that, or a person who doesn't have that 100% rating. But I think the real issue is when you're pro-life, are you pro-life from conception to natural death and in between? And I think that's where I differ from a lot of my Republican friends who claim to be pro-life. They get these kids born, then they cut them off of health care, they cut them off of early childhood, they cut them off of other things that are important to those kids having a real, true, good life. And I think that's just as important.
Mr. Gazelka.
Yeah. I think it's important, if you look back at the record, when the Democrats had the House and Senate from 2007 through 2010, not one pro-life piece of legislation made it to the governor's desk, not one. We passed at least 4. And so it's clear that whoever you put into this seat, if that gives that party majority, that agenda is moving forward. Make no mistake about it. The Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader in the Senate, they decide which bills are heard and which bills never get heard. And so it makes a difference. I'm glad my opponent says he's pro-life as well. I think that's important, and I'm glad we're close on that.
Mr. Doty?
Well, it's not just that I say I'm pro-life. I have 4 years of record, and it was 100% by MCCL's own rating each time. So it's not just saying I'm pro-life, and it's also it is true we didn't get things through. In spite of several of us in the Democratic Party voting with several people in the Republican Party, we didn't get any significant legislation passed, or at least very little. We were able to increase some funding for some good programs, but not significant changes. But one of the things that I need to point out is that if people, it's very disturbing that people use this issue politically. This is a very core belief for me. And when people claim that, oh, you can't be trusted on this, or only one party can do this, or something like that, that's very distressing. There was a piece of literature last time in the campaign that I thought was particularly offensive. It said I could not be trusted on 3 separate pro-life issues. I had authored bills on 2 of them. That's how much this gets to be a political issue. And so I urge you, look at the records, look at what's really important to people. Certainly that's an important issue, but look at all the issues.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Mr. West, and we'll start the response from Mr. Doty.
Thanks, Ray. Minnesota's taking steps right now to create a state-specific health insurance exchange under the Federal Affordable Care Act. Should the state create its own exchange, or should it take no action in that regard?
I think the state should definitely take action. I don't think the state should have the only pool out there. I think there should be some competition. I think that's a good thing. But the state should definitely take the lead. The state, I have always said this. I think we've done a lot of politicizing on the health care issue because the costs are so high that middle-class people are simply losing out. Minnesota is now the #2 state in high deductible policies. And if a deductible policy is so high that means you lose your house if you're sick, we have a real problem. So we need to do whatever we can. One of the features of the Affordable Care Act, as you mentioned, allows states to set these up. The sooner we get ours set up, the better, because I think it'll be a model, and I think it'll encourage private insurers to offer us their best shot. We had to do legislation to force them to keep their profits under 20%. So we know that they can compete. We know they can do better. And I think that's the right step. That's the right start. So I hope we get started as soon as we can.
Mr. Gazelka.
Obamacare requires health care exchanges. It's an intermediary that helps people get health insurance, and if the state does not do it, then the federal government automatically does it. So this is an area that I am aware of. I serve on the Commerce Committee. Frankly, I don't want Obamacare. He's okay with us calling it that. If the Republicans take the president and the Senate and keep the House, you'll have Obamacare repealed. We still have to deal with some of the underlying problems, and that is how do we control or make sure that costs are lowering them, or at least not going up at the rates that they are. Competition is one of them. We have to bring people in. The more people that compete in this market, the lower your rates are going to be. Minnesota mandates more coverages than virtually every other state, which drives up the cost of insurance. And so those are a couple of the things. But my opponent talked about a negative of having a high deductible plan. In fact, that's one of the strategies that we recommend people do, is take a high deductible plan, and then you get another account called a health savings account. So when you go to a higher deductible plan, you save money on the premium, and you put that into a separate account, a health savings account. And if you are healthy, you actually build up that health savings account, and in the end, if you were healthier than average, in the very end, when you retire, you can actually take that money with you. So what it promotes is people looking at every cost they have in health care, trying to live healthier, quitting smoking, eating less, exercise, and doing the things that would benefit all of us. And so that is another tool that, frankly, is a very good tool to use.
Mr. Doty, any rebuttal?
Yes. Anybody that wants to stand on a street corner and talk to the average person going by about taking out a health care plan that's very high deductible, and when they're having trouble meeting their rent or meeting their property taxes, that they're going to put money into a health health savings account is not talking about the real world in District 9.
Mr. Gazelka, any rebuttal?
This is a tool that isn't just for individuals, it's also for companies that provide it for their employees. And like I said, you take the savings and put it into a health savings account. It's designed as another tool that you can do, and to throw that out of the toolbox is a mistake.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Mr. Hall, and it will be directed first to Mr. Gazelka.
The state of Minnesota over the last 3 or 4 budget cycles, that would be over 6 to 8 years, has really patched together the budget. And in one session, of course, we had to go into special session, and the state was shut down for a while. It was patched together with a lot of one-term fixes, I think, from our tobacco fund and borrowing a lot of money from the state education fund. Question number 1 is, how can you close the obligations to our schools and repay that money to the schools and still continue to balance the budget when we're looking at more deficits in the next biennium?
Well, keep in mind that we have a $1.2 billion surplus right now that we turned to basically a $7 billion turnaround. And in addition, when we took over in 2011, we had virtually no money in the cash and budget reserve accounts. We've now built those up to $1 billion, the maximum, and we've begun to pay back the school shift. We had $700 million as a school shift this time. The prior term, it was $1.4 billion, or twice what we had. But of that $700 million, we've already paid back $300 million, and we passed legislation to pay back the rest of that, plus a little bit that was given prior to the time we got there. And so our goal is absolutely to pay back that school shift. That's a big dollar amount for schools. And just so you know what a school shift is, all that means is they're delaying payments to the schools. Well, the schools need that money, and so we want to get that to them as soon as we can. Like I said, we paid $300 million back. We passed legislation to pay the rest back. I can also tell you that in November is when we get the new budget forecasts, and we know that there's going to be enough money there that will likely be enough to pay back the rest of that school shift that we incurred during this time. The other thing I'll say is that when we passed the budgets at the end of the session, there was no school shift, there was no tobacco bonds paid up front, creating all that extra money. We passed budgets that balanced the budget without raising taxes within the money we had. Well, the governor wanted more taxes, we didn't want more taxes, and so he first offered the school shift. We agreed to a number on the school shift, but our goal was to quickly pay that off, and we've been doing that. And so it's a big deal. I mean, the other thing I'll say about education that we did to offset that school shift that we did is we increased their funding $50 per pupil. We added a literacy bonus for those schools that are doing a better job teaching their kids to read. And we also reformed the school trust lands and put management away from the DNR, and maybe we'll talk about more of that later, but that generated another $3 million for the schools.
Mr. Doty.
Well, school funding is certainly one of the most important things that we talk about with people on the doors. Anytime you walk up to a door when you're out there meeting people and there's a couple of bicycles in the yard, you know that you're going to be talking about school funding pretty soon. I don't think there's a great deal of difference, but certainly not between all people running for office on both sides here about paying that back. I think we want to pay it back because we've had a school shift basically forever, but it wasn't this big. That's the big difference. The economy is improving. This $1.2 billion surplus that my opponent talks about, that's a forecast, but the next forecast is probably going to be better because Department of Revenue says things are picking up. And so it's built in that we pay the schools back at a rate. Now, the first time we had a school shift, I think it took, was it 15 years or some really long period of time to do that. Well, that's a big burden on our schools, of course. My own hometown, Royalton, another small city, school not very far away from me, Swanville, had to actually go out and borrow money just to operate. And of course pay interest on that money, and so this is a really bad way to try to tell your local kids that they're getting the best education that money can buy when you're out there borrowing just to keep the doors open instead of offering the things that let us compete with other areas. So the school shift gets paid back when the money is there. That's automatic. So speeding it up, and especially the plan that they were going to use at the end here to speed it up by rating the rainy day fund down to probably zero, it's terrible because it rains sometimes, like we found out in Duluth. And so we do have the, thanks to the governor turning that plan down, we have money in the reserve fund, and we are on our way to paying back the school shift. And I hope we can get that school shift reduced to a number that keeps the doors open as soon as possible.
Mr. Gazelka?
Yeah. Just a couple points of clarification there. The school shift of $1.4 billion was twice what we did when Doty was there and signed and voted for it in 2010. And then as far as the rainy day fund, it was virtually zero. We built it up to $1 billion, and we said, why don't we take that other $400 million and pay back the schools right now? There'd still be $600 million in those two funds combined. We said, isn't it better to get that money to the local schools so that they can have it and let us take the risk at the state? Because our goal is not to put it on the backs of the schools. And when Representative Doty was there, they didn't pay any of it back. It was we went for it. We reduced spending. We reformed government so that we could get to a healthier spot. And that's the important difference between us. We're willing to make the tough choices. I haven't heard anything that my opponent would say as far as what he would actually reduce.
Mr. Doty?
Well, to say that we wouldn't pay that back is simply, we'll skip the word. The reason it's not paid back is because the economy didn't pick up. The money wasn't there to pay it back. Our school shift, the one that he's talking about, was a 70-30 school shift, which means we held back 30 cents on a dollar. Their school shift, which he just told you was, or ours was twice what he did, theirs held back 40 cents on a dollar. And the only way you can get to twice what we did is if you forget that they start from where we left off. So you can look at the numbers, you can see how many dollars it was, and it's not going to be that ours was twice as big. We withheld 30 cents, they withheld 40.
Thank you. Our next question will come from Mr. Wyman, and it will be directed first to Mr. Doty.
The economy continues to be a concern throughout the United States, in Minnesota, and certainly in your district and in this part of the state. The latest unemployment figure showed Minnesota at 5.9%. Unemployment in Brainerd, it's at 6.5%. How do you feel Minnesota can improve its business climate and also create more jobs, specifically in your district?
Well, this was the biggest issue last time. Everybody that got elected, I think, said jobs, 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 and people who didn't get elected were probably saying jobs, 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 and here we are 2 years later saying the same thing. It's a slow recovery. It's a slow recovery in the United States. It doesn't just depend on this country, so we are not always in control. Minnesota does better than some places, and I think we'll find some areas of agreement between my opponent and myself here. There are lots of things that we need to do to help businesses get started. One of those is to make sure that the business climate is friendly. When we look at many of the businesses in our area, we hear, and I know you hear too, that permitting needs to be streamlined. Well, things like that, within the first, I believe, 6 weeks of taking office, Governor Dayton did a lot of that streamlining by executive order. Could have been done any time in a few years before that, but it wasn't, and he took care of a lot of that, and I give him credit for that. The legislature went beyond that. They've added other things, and again, I'll give them credit for that because we need to do that to the extent possible. I think in this part of Minnesota, I see a tremendous market for retrofitting homes and businesses for energy savings. We have a lot of small businesses here that produce products, cabinets, and all these things. We have window companies here. We have door companies here. There is no reason that we can't get a little incentive going from the state to help every individual save some money on their energy bills, and have a lot of good people hired and a lot of good jobs to do that. And so I think that's a specific thing we can do here. There's no magic bullet because it's not just up to us. You can't wave a wand and create jobs. So we will do whatever we can. We will make it fit the districts, and that's, you know, anybody that's promising more than that is making a campaign promise instead of that they'll go to work on it.
Mr. Gazelka.
Well, this is an area that I'm very passionate about. I serve on the Commerce Committee. If reelected and we retain the majority, I'll be chairman of the Commerce Committee. Jobs is simple, but at the same time, the government can do a lot to get in the way. And I don't take credit I give credit to the private sector, but I do take blame when we make it difficult for them. We did pass regulatory reform, and as we submitted our Senate File 1 was about the regulatory reform. The governor made executive orders for the things that we had in there. I'm glad he did it. In the end, we had to have his signature. But just to let you know what that means is, for example, up on the Iron Range, they want to drill or mine for copper nickel. They've already drilled. It's been 7 years that they've been waiting for the permit to go ahead and do what they want to do there. They know that it's the richest or second richest deposit in the world of copper and nickel, and yet they've been waiting 7 years and have at least 2 more years they have to wait. That's crazy. There's 10,000 jobs that they estimate will be up on the range just from that one industry that we could do. And so it's very, very important. The other thing that we wanted to do that the governor rejected was reforming business property taxes. They're over twice what you'd pay for the same value for a resident versus a business. The governor vetoed that. We want to deal with frivolous lawsuits towards businesses. Why would you bring them through and make it difficult for them when it's easier for them to go to another state where it's not quite as difficult? Areas that my opponent and I are different, one of them is the angel investment credit. My opponent voted against that, which was tax credits for small businesses in rural Minnesota. We actually tried to increase that for rural Minnesota this year. The governor vetoed it. When my opponent, it was Democrats that voted for it, the governor signed it back in, I believe, 2007. Representative Ward from Brainerd voted for it, so I don't know why he voted against that. He voted for a gas tax increase. I never would have. If you're talking about hauling goods and services, that drives up the cost. And so we are different, and there are definite things that we can do.
Rebuttal.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we have to talk about a couple things here. I think the first thing we should talk about is, as long as we're talking about voting against things, your own bill to put $19.5 million into Camp Ripley, which is one of the greatest job creators we have in our area. You voted against the bonding bill that contained that. Well, that's a lot of business in our area. That's a lot of jobs to create those facilities here. I carried those bills and I voted for them because I know it's local jobs. I know the importance of that here. There are other things that were cut. Workforce development, I think you took a 15% cut. Programs to make sure that our colleges and our schools are training people for the right jobs here were cut. We need to do better at that. We need to have DEED working to figure out where people can go and get jobs. We need to take Minnesota high school kids who are doing a good job, give them a break going to Minnesota colleges if they're going to come out of there trained to do a job in Minnesota and pay income taxes later. I think that's the right direction for us to go.
Mr. Gazelka.
Just briefly, I want to say that I carried the legislation to fund an education training center at Camp Ripley. Camp Ripley is at the heart of economic development in our area. $140 million a year come into the area just because of Camp Ripley. It was a large bonding bill. We passed a $500 million bonding bill the year before and another $500 this year. I'm an assistant majority leader, which means I have a say in how things work. I will tell you that Camp Ripley, when they tried to take it out, I fought to get it back in. It did get back placed in. And I think if it came right down to it and they had to have my vote for that, I would have. But overall, the bonding bill, when you add last year's to this year, we need to be more fiscally responsible. When you think about our debt and we add more debt through bonding bills, you have to be real careful.
Thank you. This brings us to our last question of the evening, and we will go to Mr. West, and your question will be directed first to Mr. Gazelka.
Thanks, Ray. As you both know, there are two constitutional amendments on the ballot, proposed constitutional amendments, one requiring a photo ID to vote and the other limiting marriage to a man and a woman, and want to know how both of you stand on those two issues and why.
Well, I can tell you I was one of the authors of both of those. We worked on them over a 2-year period, and so I was very active on both of those. The marriage amendment, I can tell you that in other states like Massachusetts and as close as Iowa, the courts have arbitrarily just said we're going to have gay marriage. Other legislative bodies have done it. I believe the best course is to let the people of Minnesota decide. I can tell you plainly I'm a yes vote. I think marriage is where kids are best raised, and it's the one place that you can model male and female, and so that's what I support. But letting the people decide puts it out and says the people should decide this rather than the courts. And I can tell you what happened in Massachusetts, because some people say, well, nothing changes. Well, in Massachusetts, the Catholic Church immediately could no longer participate in adoptions with the state. They adopted to the most troubled kids, and suddenly they were out because they felt it should be between a man and a woman. Public schools began teaching from elementary school gay marriage. And when parents wanted to withhold their kids, the courts backed the schools up and said, you can't, and we're not going to tell you when it happened. And finally, private companies where they could give benefits to same-sex couples, now they were forced to if they gave it to married couples. As far as photo ID, the one thing I'll tell you is right now you can bring 15 people with you, vouch for them, they can vote, their vote counts, even if later we can't verify they were valid voters. With photo ID, you have to bring your ID. If you forget your ID, you can still vote, and your vote will count if you come back and prove you are who you say you are after. So it'll get rid of the 15 people. I think that takes care of election integrity. It's a lot deeper subject than that. I'd love to talk to you more. Go onto my website or give me a call, and we'll talk more.
Mr. Doty.
Both of these issues are already in the ballot, and you can vote yes or no on either or both of those, and it will have nothing to do with whether you vote for my opponent or for me. Like you, I will go and vote on November 6th on those issues. I will pull the curtain when I do that, because that's what we do in the United States. And I will give you the answer. I'll tone it down a little bit that I give everybody else when they ask me how I vote. Nobody else's business.
Mr. Gazelka.
Well, the one thing I'll say is when you're in politics, your life is a fairly open book, and I think people need to know where you stand. That's why I tell plainly, when people ask me, I give them a direct response back. I'm a definite yes on both of them. But and I will say, too, if you look back at when the Democrats had power, their intent in 2010, they declared in 2011 we'll pass gay marriage. That was Senator John Marty. They didn't know that the Republicans would take the House and Senate and go a different direction. So it's important who you elect and what they believe is important, because that influences the legislation they work on and the votes they take.
Any rebuttal?
Yes. Again, to say that Democrats and make an all-inclusive tent are in favor of one side or the other on this issue is just simply not the case. One of the reasons that I am very clear about not talking about my votes. My family came here in 1620 on the Mayflower. The great-grandson of that Edward Doty was in the Revolutionary War, helped start this country, was in the Realty Party in Boston. His great-grandson was in the Civil War. And those stories got passed down to me, how tough it is to have a democracy with nobody sitting over your shoulder knowing how you're going to vote, nobody influencing how you're going to vote. That yes or no decision that you're going to make is very important, and it should come from your heart and not from anything that I try to beat into you or look over your shoulder and try to trick you into.
Okay, thank you. That brings to conclusion our regular questioning. And so now we're going to give each candidate a 2-minute opportunity for closing. And we started with Mr. Gazelka as the opening comments, so we're going to close with Mr. Doty making his first 2-minute closing comments.
Well, thank you again, especially the panel and the crew. And again, for those of you who have spent your last hour doing this, thank you. And thank you, Paul. I think we do have great differences, but we're civil, and I think that's a very good thing, and we'll definitely continue that, I'm sure. I think it's pretty clear to those watching that there are some very great differences between us, between candidates. And again, I want to say those differences are between candidates, not necessarily parties. To have a pro-life, lifetime NRA member Democrat kind of takes some people aback once in a while, but I think that just simply proves that I'm quite a bit like the people of this district. And so I think, especially this race, we need to look at a little more than just what label is up there with somebody. I have lived and worked with the people in this district for a long, long time. I spent my adult life here in this district. The people that know me, the people that watch me in the legislature, they know that I work hard. They know I do my homework. They know I get back to my constituents. They know I represent my district and not special interests. The reason that I can represent this district real well is because I'm part of it, and I've been a part of it for a long time. And I'm like the people that are here. Like them, I want to see rural Minnesota succeed. I want to see it prosper and grow. I want to pass it on to our kids and to others that are going to use it in the future. We can do that. We can get fair funding for our schools, for our hospitals, for our nursing homes and assisted livings here. But it's going to take a lot of work, and there's no easy answer for that. But that'll be my focus. If you elect me November 6th as your next state senator, I'll go to work very hard for those things and for the people of this district. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody, for your work here.
Mr. Gazelka.
Well, again, thank you for watching. It probably wasn't quite like the presidential debate last night, but I hope you learned something about both of us. I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do, and that is that we're not going to spend more money than the resources we have, and we're going to look at reforming government to get there. It's really, really important that we make the tough decisions. It puts us in a much healthier place down the road if we continue to do that. Private sector job growth that's my background, that's my focus. I know that if we create jobs in the area, more revenue comes to the state, and we're all doing better off. The other thing I'll say is the parties are different. The parties have a platform, they have an agenda. That's what they try to accomplish, and there's a distinct difference between the two. And so if you vote for me, you can generally the pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-Second Amendment rights, reining in fiscal overspending by the government, things like that, I'm going to work on. But that's the same thing my Republican platform says as well. But you can also tell a lot about a candidate by the endorsements they get. I'm endorsed by the NRA. I think I've carried gun legislation. I actually passed gun legislation. I'm endorsed by MCCL, Minnesota Citizens Concern for Life. I'm endorsed by NFIB and Minnesota Chamber of Commerce. Those are the two groups that look at job creators. How do we help job creators? And finally, another one that I think you need to know is I'm endorsed by the Minnesota Farm Bureau. So I get ag issues. I was one of the authors of the Green Acres Reform Bill to help the farmers out. I was the chief author of the wolf hunting bill to allow cattlemen to shoot wolves if they need to. And there's a lot of things I work on locally as well because I listen to the constituents. Little Falls asked me to help them with a project related to a splash park and why the DOT was going to charge them $100,000, and was able to get it to them for nothing just by being there, listening, and doing something about it. So if you elect me, I promise to listen. I promise to do something about those things I can, and if I can't, I'll let you know. Thank you.
Thank you, both candidates. On behalf from Lakeland Public Television, we thank you for taking the time this evening to come and do a civil discussion. And you did a great job of keeping everything on time. Appreciate that very much. And best of luck to both of you in the last 30-some days of your campaigns.
Thank you.
I would like to invite you to come back again in an hour. At 9 o'clock, we will have our debate going on with the House District 9B, rather. So take an hour break, watch that local public television station for 1 hour, and come back and join us again at 9 o'clock. If you have someone who would like to see this program, didn't get a chance to see it tonight, it will be on our website in 24 hours, and that's lptv.org. lptv.org, and you can see this whole thing again if you'd like to watch that. So thank you for watching. Good evening, and we'll see you right back here at 9 o'clock.